Welcome to the WanderLearn show. I'm your host, Tapon. In this episode, I'm going to be reviewing the second best book of the year, in my opinion. It's called After the Spike. My favorite book so far this year is They're Not Gaslighting You, which you'll see in the upper right-hand corner. But this book, After the Spike, Population, Progress, and the Case for People. It's written by Dean Spears and Michael Garuso. These two authors from Texas, they are academics, are sounding a different kind of alarm. 55 years ago, there was a book that came out called The Population Bomb. Paul Ehrlich is a Stanford biologist, and he wrote this book about doom and gloom. Like, we're on the verge of mass starvation, total cataclysm, the world is going to die, population's exploding, we're all going to perish, basically. As you can tell, the biggest problem is not starvation, it's actually obesity. That is the biggest problem in the world. So The Population Bomb was a complete disaster of a book. This book, After the Spike, has a totally different type of alarm. In a couple hundred years, we're going to be down, maybe 300 years or so, we're going to be down to less than 2 billion people on this planet. That's going to be a total game changer if nothing else really changes. So let's get into this book, why I love it, why I think you should definitely check it out. First of all, let's look at the cover. Key thing on the cover tells you everything you need to know. Population has spiked. Here we are near the top of the spike, and then we'll plummet all the way down. That's what this book is about. Here you can see the spike. We are here at 8 billion people. We'll hit around 10, maximum 12 billion people, more likely like 10, and then plummet back down. Just so that you know, these guys are not crazy lunatics who have 17 children each. No, they only have 3 children between both of them. It's not as if they're having 10 children, they're trying to find a way to justify their huge families. No, they actually have relatively small families, 1.5. And the funny thing, that's what makes it ironic, is they're saying, whoa, this is dangerous. Now, let's get into the book. So this is a pretty cool graph here. You've got 1950, 1970, 2000, 2025. On the left here, on the 1950 column, at the very bottom is Luxembourg, and they are the only countries that were below replacement rate, because on the left here is the fertility rate, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So some countries had a fertility rate of 8. A lot of countries were right in the middle, and then Luxembourg was the only guy in 1950 had a below replacement rate. And you can see as we go through the years, 1975, then Germany dropped below the replacement rate, but still the vast majority of countries were above it. Year 2000, a lot more countries. Here's the territory of Macau down at the bottom here, and they were below replacement rate. And then finally we come to the year 2025, where the majority of countries are below the replacement rate, including Hong Kong and South Korea at the very bottom. What's the problem with the depopulating world? That means more resources divided with fewer people. Everybody benefits. There's going to be less pollution, less environmental problems, global warming will go away. Hey, it sounds like an Earth with 2 billion people. No problem. Well, they go into great detail. I'm not going to go into great detail in this video, but they go into great detail in the book as to why all those ideas are fallacious. And so let's get into some of the ideas. Their book has 4 parts, and each part has basically a big claim. What's claim number 1? Claim number 1 is no future is more likely than that people worldwide will choose to have too few children to replace their own generation. Over the long run, there's going to be exponential population decline. So people worldwide, you can see dropping fertility rates. Fertility rates means basically how many children does each person have. So if the fertility rate is 2, that means the average woman has 2 children. And you need a fertility rate of 2.1 to have a replacement rate. Right now, we're nowhere near that in almost every single country in this world. Only Africa is the only continent where you have a positive fertility rate, in other words, one that's above 2.1. Part number 2 and 3 is that a stabilized world will actually be better off than one that is declining. And they go into why people is actually a good thing and why it's better, not just for human beings, not just better, it's also better for the environment. And part 4 is the most difficult one. It's the fact that nobody knows how to solve this problem. Nobody knows how to solve depopulation. They go through, throughout part 4, all the different ways that countries have tried through giving money, giving incentives, giving childcare, all sorts of different ways that countries have tried to boost their fertility rates, and nothing has worked for long. Sometimes you get a little bit of jump in fertility, and then it just goes back down again. So this is a major demographic change that we're going to witness in this century and beyond, and that's what this whole book is about. And if you believe in the importance of demographics and how it determines the fate of many things, this book is for you. So this is another view of the spike. We are here at 8 billion. Now, what happens if our fertility rate drops as the entire planet goes down to 1.2 like China? If it is, we spike all the way down here. Now, if we go to Luxembourg at 1.4, the whole world behaves like Luxembourg, and then we'll spike down a little bit later. If we all behave like Bulgarians, we'll be at 1.6, and this is where we will spike. And then finally, if the whole world behaves like France, and we have a fertility rate of 1.8, which again is below replacement rate of 2.1, we'll have a decline like this. Now, take a look at this graph. Pretty much in the grand scheme of things, it's the same story. Whether you're 1.2 or 1.8, in the end, we're going to have a vast decline in our population, no matter what we do. This is why the sense of urgency of these authors saying, hey, we need to stabilize, because otherwise, if we are below replacement rate, whether it's 1.8 or 1.2, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. We're going down, baby. But what about longevity, you say? What if human beings last and live for 300 years? Won't that solve everything? Actually, they say, no, it doesn't actually solve. It just delays things a little bit, but in the end, it doesn't solve anything, especially if those 300-year-old human beings decide not to have children. If they only have, let's say, 1.5 children each, still got the same problem. It's just a little bit delayed because they're living for 300 years, but that's about it. If, on the other hand, in the first century of their life, they have 2 children, the second century, they have another 2, and then the third century, they have another 2, well, then they have 6 children. Problem solved. In fact, you're going to have an increasing population. But the math just tells you that having longer lived human beings is not going to, quote unquote, solve this problem. It's not going to stabilize our population for long. Let's look at another graph from this book. In this graph, you'll see that if we stabilize our population tomorrow, if we go to 2.1 tomorrow, we're going to go from 8 billion to about 12 billion and then stabilize at 12 billion. That's what would happen if we were to stabilize tomorrow. Of course, we're not going to stabilize tomorrow. We are depopulating. So here, if we never destabilize, we're just going to decline down to the year 2500 and just slowly but surely go well below 1 billion. If we stabilize in a few years, in a few decades or a century, these other lines appear. So the bottom line is, as long as you aim for stabilization, you're going to get a number that's, well, anywhere between 12 billion and less than that, depending on where. And either way, they're saying that's manageable. Another thing that a lot of people instinctively think is that, well, wait a second. Isn't more humans creating more environmental problems? It's not necessarily the case. A lot of places that have more population actually now have cleaner air, cleaner water, because as we get richer as a society, and usually we become richer as a society as our population grows, often there's a good correlation there, that people living in the 21st century are living much better than the average person in the 20th century, and the average person in the 20th century lived better than the average person in the 19th century, and the 19th century lived better than the 18th century. Basically, there's been a forward progress, and along that has been a steadily increasing population globally. And so there's no reason to believe that if we had a population of, let's say, 10 billion people, that those 10 billion people would, on average, live better than the 8 billion people that live in this century. The other thing is, check out this graph about the CO2. The CO2 levels are actually going to decrease on a per capita basis. This is our lifetime emissions in tons of CO2. The authors are at the peak, roughly at the peak. The author's parents emitted a little bit less CO2, but their children are emitting less CO2 than the authors of this book, which are, by the way, in their 50s. And then finally, their grandchildren, the author's grandchildren, are probably going to be going down. Basically, they're saying that the lifetime emissions of CO2 is declining with time. And so on a per capita basis, we are emitting less and less CO2, which is a good thing. In Europe, the average person is having 1.5 children. So that means the next generation will be 25% smaller than the previous generation. You keep that going, 25%, 25%, you can see how the decline is going to kind of pick up in an exponential fashion. That's how we're going to get down so low. And that could spell a lot of problems for a lot of people. Now, will other things solve this? Maybe designer babies? They don't really talk about that. Maybe if you can clone yourself, people who have big egos will feel a lot better. Like, well, great. Could I have 10 versions of myself? Well, great. I'll make 10 children. Maybe. The other thing they don't talk too much about is the fact that, well, as long as we are increasing, and in fact we are still increasing, we're going to be going to 9 billion before we go down to 7 billion. As long as we're increasing, things like wildlife will suffer. So the book doesn't really talk too much about the wildlife impact, and I wish it would have talked a little bit more about that. But ultimately, once we hit the top of the spike, we're going to be going downhill. And as a result, a lot of the wildlife will come back because as the population declines from 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, the wildlife will have more place to live. So that is one of the benefits, I suppose, of a decreasing population. But also remember that rich societies tend to protect their areas more than others, than poor societies. Rich societies can afford to make national parks and things like that. They can afford to have maybe a denser living. They can do vertical farming, for example. They have the money to do that so that they can create more wildlife spaces. A poor society doesn't have those benefits. Now, check out this graph right here. This is a fun way to visualize how you can have stabilization in a variety of ways. There's the U-shaped graph where 4 out of 10 women have no children and 3 out of 10 women have 4 children. And then about 2 out of 10 women have 3 children. So basically a U-shaped design here. This is one way to have a stable population. Here's another. That's probably a very unlikely scenario where you have some people having 4 and a lot of people having 0. And then, it's unlikely. Most things are like a bell-shaped. This is also an unusual scenario where the vast majority of people, 42%, have 1 children, almost the same amount, 4 and 10 roughly, having 3 children, and then these kind of outliers. Unlikely scenario, but it's another way to make it happen to have stabilization. This is probably the more likely scenario if you want stabilization. Roughly half the population getting 2 children, and then you have 14% having 1, 9% having 0, 22% having 3, and 5% having 4. And then finally you have another somewhat unlikely scenario where you have this kind of distribution. The point is that all these are ways to stabilize the population, just different ways that we can spread things out. I kind of think that the bell curve is the most likely because that's what you see most likely in nature. What about energy consumption? You might be worried about that. That makes sense because obviously 10 billion people are going to consume much more energy than if we have far fewer than 10 billion people. On the other hand, some of the efficiencies that we've gotten of energy production have come because we have more scientists, more people, energy researchers. We may eventually have one day nuclear fusion, for example, which would solve a lot of energy problems. Just nuclear fission, in fact, it's a very clean form of energy that doesn't emit any CO2. We have that tech today. A lot of coal-fired plants even are much cleaner in burning coal than we had in the past. Solar power has dramatically gone down in price. Part of that is economies of scale. What is economies of scale? More people buying it. That helps that we have more people. So as a result, we're using renewables at a much higher pace. And finally, the cost of solar energy is going to be about the same as fossil fuels, enabling a lot more technology. All this is driven to a large extent because people, and having more people allows more innovation. I think it was Jeff Bezos who said that wouldn't it be great to have, instead of just one Einstein, 5 Einsteins because our population is so big. Now, listen, I am a contrarian in this. Although the authors of After the Spike make a fantastic point that we are headed to a demographic collapse in the next 60 years or so when we're going to start going downhill. And I can see how the math checks out. On the other hand, I just think that human beings will come up with new innovations. Robotics will have other reasons to tinker with our DNA, genetic engineering, all sorts of other stuff that's going to enable us to have a much bigger population. And especially as we expand to the stars and into the heavens, we might build O'Neill cylinders. We might start populating the moon and Mars. I'm talking about in many centuries from now, in the long run, we might have 1 trillion human beings populating the solar system. Now, the vast majority of them would still be on Earth, but I think we underestimate the power of humanity and their ingenuity. I do think, though, at the same time, while I say that, I do see the math, and the math checks out. We are in the generation that's kind of peaking. Get this statistic right here. In 2012, there was 146 million human beings born. 146 million. That was the most number of human beings that were ever born in 1 year. That was in 2012. Ever since then, there have been fewer than 146 million human beings being born every year. And it will probably, unless things change dramatically, never get above 146. Now, the other thing that's misunderstood by the authors, that some people, and they've drilled this in to make sure you don't misunderstand it, they're not saying we're here to force women to have babies. If women don't want to have babies, they don't have to have babies. They're not trying to take away the right to an abortion. If you want to have an abortion, have an abortion. They're not trying to roll back all the advances that women have made, because obviously a lot of the reason for this demographic change has happened because of women having more freedom. And as they've gained freedom, they have decided to have fewer children. And they're saying, we're not trying to take away any of that. But still, what they're trying to say is, can we make it so that it's not so costly, not such of a burden? Can we reward people for deciding to be parents? Can we give more support structure for them to make it, more palatable? Because a lot of people may want to have 3 children, but they're like, you know what? I'll just have 1. That's plenty, because it's too expensive to have otherwise. Can we change our societies and the incentives? And yet that goes back to part 4, where they're saying, we're not even sure what the right incentives are. There's still a lot of mysteries to be had. Check out this other graph from the book. In this last slide, you'll see how the fertility will finally rebound or stabilize if we reach replacement levels in the year 2125. 2125 will get there, and you'll see a stabilization of around 8.5 billion or something like that. If, on the other hand, we wait and we don't take action to try to stabilize until you hit the year 2150, then you're going to see it stabilize around 7 billion or so. And to stabilize around 6 billion, we'd have to stabilize by the year 2175. So these are the different ways that we can stabilize. And the longer we delay, the longer we decide to just let the inertia of our decline in population take hold. And we're going to just have a smaller stabilization, a lower general number for the whole population of the world. Let me end with one final point. Let's say there's an asteroid that is headed our way that will kill humanity just like they knocked off all the dinosaurs. And that's kaput, we're done, finished forever. Let's just assume that's the case. And by the way, it's inevitable. The other thing that's inevitable is that volcanoes will start to erupt like crazy and eventually engulf the world, because it does that every few 100 million years. Homo sapiens are the only species on Earth who are capable of either controlling out of control volcanoes, and also the only species on Earth that can actually deflect an asteroid. But could we have the technology to do that if we only had 1 billion people? Probably not. It'd be a lot easier if we had 10 billion people, because we can marshal them far more resources. We can put together far more brains. I'm not saying you need 10 billion people knocking in a nail to whatever, let's say, bombs that we go up to kind of deflect these asteroids. No, but we need the brains, the internal brains, to think. The internal brains, maybe if nothing else, to build AIs that can help us, artificial general intelligence or super intelligence, to help us come up with the technology that we need in order to deflect an asteroid from coming to kill us. Not just us, but all life on Earth. In fact, all life on Earth, to a large extent, depends on us to be able to protect the Earth from an asteroid or perhaps even volcano. So there's a certain amount of responsibility, and we can do that as a species much better if we have 10 billion people on the Earth than if we only have 1 billion people on the Earth. And that's an interesting argument that I want you to think about. But what do you think? Tell me in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel, to my podcast at WanderLearn.com, and become one of my patrons at patreon.com. For $2 a month, you can get my book that I'm writing about Africa. It's just $2 a month, and you can get every chapter as I write them. I appreciate your support, and check out the book. If you decide to buy it, use the link below, and I appreciate it. I get a little affiliate link from that. I think it's a great book, very thought-provoking, and makes you less guilty for deciding to have kids, and maybe motivated. When I was a child, reading The Population Bomb, or I didn't read it actually, but hearing about it because it was everywhere, made me say like, oh God, kids, not a good idea. But now I'm like, you know what? Not a bad idea. Not a bad idea. In fact, maybe it's a good idea. So tell me what you think about all this in the comments below. This is Francis Tapon, encouraging you to wander and learn.